Okay, Micah chapter 2, and this is going to come on of course, from chapter 1, the looming captivity that's going to come to them. And it's not just one captivity, it's the Assyrian captivity and the kind of, what's the hints at the Babylonian captivity that's going to come later. And we'll just go through this chapter and discuss it, and then go back and go through questions about it. So, kind of like we did last time. In verses a rough outline, verses 1 through 5, we have the irony of the destruction that's coming to them, and we'll see that as we go through. 6 through 11 is about the false teachers that they had during those times, and then 12 and 13 is a hint at the possible redemption that would come later. And this is where we start getting into the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. That's so important because we all know that people misuse prophecies of the Messiah to talk about the end of time, when, especially in the Old Testament, it's talking about the coming of the Messiah. It's talking about the coming of the Messiah when Jesus was born, right, on this earth. That's the idea. And we'll see how that comes out. And sometimes messianic prophecy is not actually messianic prophecy, too. You know, there are not very many places you go to where we have messianic prophecies, and they say, this is about the Messiah. It usually doesn't say it at all. So we have to understand what it's saying and then apply it and see if it actually worked. We can know it also from the New Testament, right? If the New Testament said this is about Jesus, then we can know it undoubtedly. But sometimes the message is simply about resurrection. Well, not simply about resurrection. Sometimes the message is about the return from captivity, the success that God's going to give to them, how they're going to overcome their enemies, that kind of thing. That sounds very messianic, but it may or may not be necessarily about Jesus. Okay, well, let's just get into this and we'll see. So he says in chapter 2 and verse 1, "Woe to those who devise iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. At morning light they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand." Now, we actually talked about this last week, how that one of the sins that they were committing was that they had the power to do things, and they were taking advantage of the power that they had in order to accomplish their own ends, their own means. This is part of the problem that's coming. That's why disaster is coming on them. And this is not about accidental, obviously. It's not accidental evil, right? We accidentally hurt someone, or we accidentally did this or that, or we were misinformed, or anything like that. This is representing people who were staying up late at night, thinking on their beds, how can I do this, right? What can I do to accomplish what I want? Anybody think of an example of that would fit this in their time frame, that would fit what's this description? They're cunning and conniving in order to try to find out a way to take things from other people. Jezebel and Ahab. So I think it's 2 Kings 12. Let me double check here. Nope, that's Josiah repairing the temple. Okay, so Jezebel and Ahab. We know the account, right? How did it begin? What was it that Ahab wanted that Jezebel helped him get? Sorry? Naboth's vineyard, right? So he wanted this land, and how did he try to get it? Tried to buy it. Yeah, this is a legitimate way to do this, right? So I'm gonna go buy this field, and I think we actually talked about this last week. Why was it that Naboth wouldn't sell? Right. They couldn't sell their inheritance to other people outside of their tribe. and also he just didn't want to sell. So he has the right to keep it or sell it. But then Ahab was upset about this and went home, and he was pouting and crying on his bed, right? And Jezebel came and said, "What's going on? Why are you upset?" And he told her, and what did she say? "I'll get it for you. Yeah, don't worry." So she now has a plan. She devised this plan in order to get it. That's bothering me. I thought it was 1 Kings 12. Oh, 1 Kings 21. I had the numbers. I dyslexic. Okay, so 2 Kings chapter 21 is where this is found. And are you sure? Oh, I'm in 2 Kings. It's 1 Kings 21. You think I didn't have anything prepared? I've got notes up here, I promise. All right, 1 Kings chapter 21. Naboth is murdered. So look at verse 7. We'll start there. Jezebel, his wife, said to him, "You now exercise authority over Israel. Arise, eat food, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." And she wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with a seal, and sent the letter to the elders and the nobles who were dwelling in the city of Naboth, with Naboth. She wrote in the letter, saying, "Proclaim a fast and set Naboth with high honor among the people, and set 2 men, scoundrels, before him to bear witness against him, saying, 'You have blasphemed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him, that he may die.' So the men of the city, the elders and the nobles who were inhabitants of the city, did as Jezebel had sent to them, as it was written in the letters which she had sent to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth with high honor among the people, and 2 men, scoundrels, came in and sat before him. And the scoundrels witnessed against him, against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, 'Naboth has blasphemed God and the king.' Then they took him outside of the city and stoned him with stones so that he died. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, 'Naboth has been stoned and is dead.' It came to pass, when Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said to Ahab, 'Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive, but dead.' So it was, when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab got up and went down to take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." All right, so this is where this is an example of what's going on in Micah chapter 2 and verse 1, where they're devising iniquity. And that's certainly not the only thing that happened, but it is a perfect example of what was happening. And I think we can see it happening, in other places as well. All right, so coming back to chapter 2 and verse 1, or chapter 2 and verse 2, it says, "They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses, and seize them. They oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance." So the oppression here is related to, this is a, Hebrew poetry, again, it's parallel statements, right? So usually they're statements that parallel one another. Sometimes they contrast one another so that you can see a difference, but now it's an emphasis to help us understand a little bit better. And the 2 ideas here is the coveting the fields and houses and seizing them versus oppressing a man in his house and his inheritance. So this is not just about taking people's houses, although that's wrong, it's bad. But this is also related to the inheritance of people, right? So this is related to, it's a bigger picture than just somebody who's taking somebody else's house. That's bad enough. But now they're also messing with the inheritance, which is what God intended for Israel to have. They have their own boundaries, as we talked about before. That's why Naboth didn't want to sell his land, because he couldn't sell it outside of his own tribe. And this is an example of that. His tribe is his inheritance. And so what happens if you start selling your land to other tribes, then you start having problems with the boundaries, right? Where did the boundaries come from that they had? Right. They came from God, specifically came from God. They cast lots in the book of Joshua so that they would be given land allotments, and Moses mapped out for them, this is the land that you have. And he told them the boundaries and everything. They were not only to go in and possess that land, but they were to maintain that land and protect it. And so while we have, it's kind of like the United States. We have Israel, as a whole, but they're really almost separate countries inside. They're not really countries, but kind of like us. And they were allowed to sell their land as much as they wanted to, but only within their own tribes, so that those boundaries would stay the same. And then, of course, the year of Jubilee, they were supposed to give it back, and there's all kinds of rules related to it. Okay, so now they're coveting the fields, they're taken by violence, they're pressing a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I'm devising disaster from which you cannot remove your necks, nor shall you walk haughtily, for this is an evil time. So this is Micah chapter 2. And the idea here, of course, is that he's going to be punishing them because of the sins. And notice what he says here. What is he, when he says, I'm devising disaster, how does that relate to the things we've already said, that we've already talked about them doing? Does your translation say something different in verse 3? I'm devising disaster. Planning against this family a calamity, right? So here's the irony that's going on. We have the people who are plotting and scheming to hurt people and take their inheritance, and God says, I'm planning and plotting a disaster for you because of these activities. Right? I'm going to do the same thing to you that you're doing to other people. And, of course, he is doing it as punishment because he's the one who has the right to do that. And he says, you will not walk haughtily, and because of this evil time that they're in, for this is an evil time. That's the irony. He is acting against his family. He says, behold, against this family I'm devising a disaster. Again, Micah we noticed in chapter 1 that he had wordplay going on with the names of towns and stuff, and now we're seeing irony that's brought out in the way he wrote, which God told him to say. And so it's really difficult to miss that. And he is God is coming against the family, in this case it would be Israel, and doing the same thing to them that they're doing to the people even in their own family. And then he says that which you cannot remove, from which you cannot remove your necks. Right? In chapter 1, he said that a little bit differently, but he told them that it was an incurable disease, that they couldn't be saved. And he's saying here, it's going to come, and it's going to be something that you can't remove yourself from. There's nothing you can do about it, and you're not going to walk haughtily anymore, for this is an evil time. So there's quite a bit here. In an evil time, doesn't that suggest that humanity does this, right? We do this yo-yo thing. We go, sometimes are better than others. And I don't know if we're always going to be able to recognize we're in the best of times, but there are pendulum swings. And right now, we see Israel in a very bad place. And this is just some of the evidence of the things that were happening. We've already seen that they're worshiping other gods. That was chapter 1. And now they're talking about how they're treating one another. That's another important part of this. I think the ESV says that it's going to be a time of disaster instead of an evil time. Basically the same idea. In that day, one shall take up a proverb against you and lament with a bitter lamentation, saying, we are utterly destroyed. He has changed the heritage of my people. How he has removed it from me. To a turncoat he has divided our fields. Therefore you will have no one to determine the boundaries by lot in the assembly of the Lord. All right, a lot of references here, too, to the older times. And others are going to see them as a proverb. That this is what, in that day, one shall take up a proverb against you. They're going to see this. And that part of that is the irony. Part of that is the lesson that other people are going to learn. You know, sometimes I realized the other day when I was thinking about actually the sermon this morning that we have a kind of an interesting idea in our culture that we should never punish people because it's always about reform, right? We want to give them the chance to change. And I agree that people need the opportunity to change. But punishment is an important part of discipline. Punishment is an important part of making sure that truth and goodness remain, right? So let's take, for example, the argument about whether or not people should be put to death for crimes, right? We're going in the civil world. In Romans, which we talked about Wednesday, we talked about the fact that the government has the authority. He says they don't carry the sword in vain. That's an implication of ultimately death, the death penalty for people, although it has other implications. So when we're thinking about that, and we take a murderer and we put him to death, one of the reasons that's opposed is because we should never punish, we should only reform. And you can't really reform someone who is put to death, right? It's over. But so that's just pure punishment, right? But what's the value in that punishment? Is there any value? Yeah. Well, it saves money, true. But yes, it is a deterrent. It won't. Well, it certainly will deter that man from ever doing it again. But it will also give other people ideas that maybe I shouldn't do that. I'm gonna be more careful not to do that, right? And even I think it's the book of Ecclesiastes says that the people are more prone to error and sin because punishment is not meted out quickly, right? It's just delay. And if I kill someone, I got to stay in prison for the rest of my life. Okay, that's not so bad for people. It's bad. I'm not saying it's not, but it's better than the alternative of being put to death. And so if I do that, then I get away with it, basically. And that encourages other people to be the same way. Well, when God punishes nations, it's very much for the same reasons. There are other people going to learn lessons as well. And one of the lessons, and this is a pretty hard one, one of the lessons is if God will destroy his own people, what will he do with everyone else, right? If God will punish his people, what will he do for everyone else? And that doesn't mean that they learn the lesson, but the lesson is there if they want to take it. And so I think it's an important part of that. So now he's coming in them. He's gonna. Here's this proverb in verse 4: the lament with a bitter lamentation, saying, "We are utterly destroyed. He has changed the heritage of my people. How he has removed it from me." All right, what's that talking about? How is God going to change the heritage of the people? How was it that the inheritance was changed by these people themselves, or attempting to be changed? Let's start with that. True, but they were doing it by taking other people's lands that were outside their tribes, right? So their borders were being changed by their own sinful activities. And now, here's the irony, well, you're doing all that, I'm about to take that inheritance away from you. And that means it's also related to their borders, right? But now we have somebody coming in who's not going to respect any of their borders at all. It's going to destroy them. The Assyrians came in, and there were people that were left, but most of the people in the northern Israel were taken into captivity, and they were just spread all over the place. And so they didn't have any land left. And this is a perfect way of saying it. Again, if you look at this, he says he's changed the heritage of my people. He has removed it from me. And to a turncoat, he has divided our fields. He's divided it all up. It's not theirs anymore. It's divided up between all kinds of other people. And the Assyrians, in putting them in different parts of the world, their policy was just spread everyone out, so they also put people from other parts of the world into Israel. And we have difficulties and problems that are going to come up because of that, and especially in the southern part with Judah. But that nation was no more in the north. Okay, so he's devising a plan against them. He knows exactly what's going to happen, and he's telling them this is going to be bad for you. Therefore, you will have no one to determine the boundaries by lot in the assembly of the Lord, which is a reference to, again, we talked about already, when Joshua divided up the inheritance of the people. It was by lot. It was by God's design. God said, here are your boundaries, and he says, that's over. You don't have that anymore. And that's a recognition that God's finished with them. They're done. And they won't ever have that again. So that's an idea that relates to the atrocities of the thing that they were going through at the time. They're utterly destroyed. They lost their heritage, and it was taken to them from them. Now, the idea of turncoat here in verse 4, the very end, is, I know other translations say something different. Does yours say something besides turncoat? It says, to a turncoat he has divided our fields. Traitor, okay. Apostate. That's kind of the idea, is someone who's an apostate. And it's a play on words. This is irony. The people are being destroyed for turning their backs on God. Now God has taken their heritage away and given it to other people. And this is something that I've written here. The ones he gave it to are the ones that Israel now sees as traitors. It only makes sense that God would give the heritage to those who repent and turn to him again. Ironically, those who turn back to God are seen as turncoats because they turned away from the ways of Israel. So in effect, the turncoats had people turn back from them, back to God, and receive his blessings as a result. That's one of the possible understandings of this. So when Israel is taken into captivity, eventually some people are going to come back. And when this is about Judah and going to Babylon. And when they come back, by the way, most people didn't come back, but some of them did. They came back and they reestablished the nation. Well, now the ones who've taken it over would have been considered traitors because they, instead of turning against God, which Israel was doing, they were coming back to God. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is it's just talking about someone who is a terrible person, which definitely fits the Assyrians. They could be called turncoats, I guess, in that sense. And they're losing it to evil people. All right, so now does anybody have any questions or comments about this first 5 verses? Okay. The second section is going to be about the false teachers that were there. Verse 6, do not prattle, you say, to those who prophesy. So they shall not prophesy to you. They shall not return insult for insult. Okay. The word prattle and prophecy, what does the word prattle mean? Did you have a different translation? Speak out, a constant speaking out, flow. The New King James kind of interprets it instead of translates it, and they're saying don't prattle. Stop. Prattle means to give worthless information is the idea. You're just talking to hear yourself talk. Interestingly enough, the word prattle here and prophecy are the same word in Hebrew. So they just, like I said, they interpreted it to mean prattle. But he's talking about people giving prophecies, and he's telling them, do not prattle, you say. So this is quotations from them, don't tell us these prophecies. Now, Jeremiah had the same problem whenever he was preaching. All the prophets had the problem. When they would speak out, they would tell them the people would tell them to shut up and stop telling us this stuff. They didn't believe it. They didn't want to believe it, and therefore they're going to shut them down. That's one of the reasons that Jeremiah was arrested and thrown in the pit. There's all kinds of things that happened to prophets just because they were telling what God said. So it's probably then said in mockery. The ESV says, do not preach, thus they preach. The idea of this verse is that they don't want people telling the truth about what's going to happen. And nobody likes to hear bad news, right? We hear that today, right? We hear that over and over. Don't be negative. Well, I mean, there's some truth to that, but sometimes things are negative. Sometimes it's just bad, and we got to talk about it. So it says they shall not return insult for insult. And in other words, if you don't want these people to talk, they're just going to stop, and it's not going to be there for you anymore, especially when they're taken into captivity. You who are named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord restricted? Are his doings, are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? All right. Literally, has the Spirit of the Lord grown short? Does God not have any power anymore? It seems that God is responding to questions that they're asking. So, is the Spirit of God unable to help? Are these the things that he's doing? And these are questions that will come up in times of destruction. The ESV says, has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Right. So people are going to be recognizing and confused by what's going on because they wouldn't hear. They don't know what's happening, and they're asking, is God doing this? Is the Holy Spirit now not able to hold these things back or help us in any way because of the sins that they're being punished for? And they were being warned. Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? I think that's the answer. You know, the Word of God only benefits the people who are actually living it, right? What does James chapter 2 tell us about faith and works? Faith without works is dead. It's useless, is the idea. And so we can hear the Word of God all we want to, but if we don't ever adapt ourselves to it, then we are in trouble because it's not going to benefit us at all. Remember the parable that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 6, the wise man and the foolish man? The wise man built his house on the what? On the rock, right? On the solid foundation. The winds came, the rains came, and the wind blew against the house, and it stood firm. Then the man who built it on the sand, winds and the waves came, what happened? Crashed, fell down. And he said, this is what happens for the one that was stable. This is what happens when people do what I'm telling them to do. It has nothing to do with understanding it. I mean, you have to understand it. It's not about whether you believe it. It's about whether you do it. And if we will do it, we will live by the way God wants us to live. Things will be much better for us. It's going to be difficult either way, but things will be much better for us in the long run. And so this is what he's saying to them. You know, do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? Of course they do. Of course they do. Lately, my people have risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment for those who trust you as they pass by, or from those who trust you as they pass by, like men returned from war. That's an interesting one. My people have risen as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment. What do you think that means? What's the difference between a robe and a garment? Let's start with that. Ornaments? I guess it's a matter of interpretation. I don't know. There's a robe, and they would normally have a robe, and then they'll have an outer garment to protect that, especially I guess if it's cold. And now he says you're taking you pull off the robe with the garment. All right. So what does that imply then? And these are people who are walking by as if they're coming home from war. What kind of condition would you be in if you're coming home from war and you're walking home? Not in a good place, right? Probably tired, weary, hungry, ready to get home, have a nice bit of nap. And while they pass by, he says, you're taking the robe with the outer garment. What does that imply? Any ideas? It's not just that they're taking their outer garment. They're also taking the robe with it. In other words, these are people who are vulnerable, and you're not just taking something and leave them a little bit. You're taking everything. You're taking their inheritance, you're taking their heritage, and they have no power to stop you, right? That's the picture that he's painting here. And they've risen up then as an enemy. Who are they an enemy against? The people that they're taking this stuff from. Their own people. And who are the ones who are oppressing these people? It's the people who are rich, the people who are in power, and probably both. And they're coming up with people who are in need, and instead of helping them, they're taking everything they can from them because they can get away with it. Because, as we said in verse 1, because it's in the power of their hand. They can do it if they want to, and they are. So this is why it's such a bad thing. Chapter 1 was all about how they treated God by worshiping idols. Chapter 2 is about how they treated each other by oppressing people who were taking advantage of people who had nothing or no ability to protect themselves. So he says, the women of my people you cast out, in verse 9. From their pleasant houses, from their children, you have taken away my glory forever. All right, so they're being cast out because they are, their lands are being taken from them. Some people have translated or interpreted this to mean the widows, which is a good possibility, but it could just be women in general. Now they didn't have it. I don't know where the men would be, but they're taking it from the women too. The women of the people are being cast out. Why were they being cast out? Their houses are being taken from underneath them. They have no recourse. They have nothing to do. There's no way that they can help. What would happen if they went to the high priest and said, hey, this is happening to me? You know what would happen? Nothing. He's probably in on it. This is how corrupt the society has become. There's no recourse for the people. And from their children, he says, you have taken away my glory forever. So when we treat other people badly, we affect God. How does the glory relate to God? How is the glory being taken away from him? We know it. Okay, so we know that it's because of the sin that they're committing, right? Remember the word Jacob. I believe it's Jacob. No, Israel. You remember what Israel means? The glory of God. And now they're taking that glory away by the way that they're treating one another. These are the people of God. These are the people that God redeemed from Egypt and led them for the 40 years in the wandering, and has been with them this whole time. And now things have gotten so bad, they're removing the glory from God himself by the way they treat. People would look at the Israelites and say, what kind of God did they serve? You know, like I said, the way we treat one another. What did Jesus say was the way that we're going to be able to convince people that he came from God? You remember? You're mouthing it. By our love for one another. That's it. He didn't say you're going to be able to formulate a master argument and logically prove, although you can do that. He didn't say you're going to be able to argue and fight. He said you're going to prove it by the way you treat one another. And that implies that if we treat one another badly, poorly, what does that say about, what does that do for the glory of God? You know, in Europe, I've noticed, I was told this when I was young, and putting two and two together, it kind of made sense it would happen here too. But in Europe, the growth of atheism has been rampant. It's exponentially growing. Do you know the reason for that? There's a lot of reasons. But one very important reason, when you got different religious groups claiming to be Christians, and they're fighting wars against one another because of doctrines, literal wars, what does that do to the rest of the people? These guys don't have anything figured out. They have wars just like we do. What do they say about, I forgot what the topic was. Let's talk about divorce. You know what the divorce rate is in people, in families and homes that call themselves Christian families compared to the rest of the world? Do you know what it is? The same. Because we treat one another just like the world does. It may not, I don't know if anyone's done stats for the churches of Christ. I have no idea. I wouldn't doubt that it's pretty close to the same because we've incorporated so much of the world into our thinking and our way of life. There are a lot of things related to that, you know. We just need to be careful, and here's the same way with them when they're going through. All right. Wow, I'm going slower than I realized. Verse 10 says, "Arise and depart, for this is now your rest, because it is defiled. It shall destroy, yes, with utter destruction. If a man should walk in a false spirit and speak a lie, saying, I will prophesy to you of wine and drink, even he would be a prattler to this people." Okay, so lots of implications there, but the when he says, "This is not your rest," he's saying, "Arise and depart." He's telling them, leave. You need to leave now. And he's going to make it happen. And he says, "This is not your rest. It's defiled. It shall destroy. Yes, with utter destruction." That rest he's talking about is what was promised. In Psalm 132 and verse 14, it talks about this rest that God provided for his people. Also in Leviticus chapter 18, it's talking about the same rest. Joshua gave them rest, but God says, "This is not your rest. It's not any rest at all now." They've defiled it, and they've taken it away. And so the warning coming from Leviticus and other passages, remember in Deuteronomy, is the same thing. They had people on two sides of, two mountains, and people were divided up, and one was for woes and one was for blessings. And so Moses had them call out the blessings that come from following God, and the other side, Moses had them calling out the woes that were going to come if they departed from God. And one of the things that they said in those woes, there were a lot more woes than blessings, was that if you defile the land will kick you out, and God's going to do that because he cannot abide to have the land filled with innocent blood. So if a man should walk in a false spirit and speak a lie, saying, "I will prophesy to you of wine and drink," even he would be a prattler to this people. The idea here, I think, is that people are looking for those who will say, "Don't worry, good times are coming." That's what they want to hear. Does that remind you of anything in the New Testament? 2 Timothy chapter 4 tells us that there will be people who have itching ears, and they seek out people who tell them the things they want to hear. And do we not see that? I don't know how many times I've said this in lessons. Listen, if you want to believe an error, I promise you, if you look around enough, you're going to find a church that will teach it. But that's not what we want to do. We want to find the truth. And so we need to make sure that what we're listening for, what we're looking for when we hear is what God actually says, and not what a lot of people decide, "Hey, this sounds good to me," right? We need to be very, very careful in the things that we listen to. But now we have infinite possibilities, right? If you can't find a church locally that will teach the things that you want to hear, you can just go online and find it now, right? And you can search the internet and scour it, and conveniently now we even have it to where I get advertisements for churches, for organizations who help churches create online presences so that they can have worship online instead of having a place to meet. And that's going to be more and more the case, especially with virtual reality that's coming. You put the headset on, you can see people. It's still not the same. God says he wants his people together. But regardless of that, we have people who are saying, "Hey, whatever you want to believe, we'll find you a place. There is a place that will teach what you want." And that's the last thing. What we need to be doing is finding out more and more, what does the Bible say, right? And are you teaching what the Bible says? And that if you ever hear something that's taught that's not in the Scriptures, you need to be asking questions. What do you mean? Why is this the case? And if you can't get answers, then leave, because you don't want to be around that kind of person, those kind of people. And I say that for here too. If I'm teaching something that you can't back up or you can't understand in the Scriptures, I'm talking about something that not matters of opinion, and you can't get a good answer, that means I've been corrupted somehow, or the elders have been corrupted, or somebody has been. And so we need to be careful and always check the Scriptures. All right, so he says, I will surely assemble all of Jacob. I want to get these last two verses in. Verse 12. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of the pasture. They shall make a loud noise because so many people. The one who breaks open will come up before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. Their king shall pass before them with the Lord at their head. Now, here's a reference to later on. And this is people, John chapter 10, Jesus uses the words that he uses in John chapter 10 as a reference to this. This is depicting one who is a king who is leading the people out to pasture as a man who is a shepherd. And Jesus calls himself that. And just one last thing, I want you to notice what he said, like sheep of the fold in verse 12. He says, I will assemble you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. There are people that today they're teaching the 10 lost tribes, so to speak. I heard a thing the other day that said the 10 lost tribes went underground, and they're literally in a huge cavern underground that's as big as a continent, and they're living there, just waiting for their opportunity to come back. All kinds of crazy things. There are people that teach that the 10 lost tribes came over to America, which has been proven wrong in many different ways. But I want you to notice what he says. He says, I'm going to put them back together. Israel and Jacob are going to put back together. There aren't any lost tribes. They all came back together when Judah was taken into captivity. 70 years later, they were told to go home. That was over the entire empire of the Babylonians. And anyone who was a Jew, whether they were from the north or the south, they were all allowed to go home. And a lot of them did. So anyway, that's just a side point. All right, thank you very much. We'll start with chapter 3 next week.